phenomenal lineup of speakers tonight, and I'm going to try and get out of the way as quickly as I can, because I know Dr. Stephen Norris really wants to get going on his chat about LTAD. He's already firing at a great rate. So let's not pull any more punches. Let's just get started, get into it. We're all here to learn. So let's learn from one of the best. Take it away.
So I'm able to share my screen and show these slides, am I? Okay, I'll try and do that. Yeah, here we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen, and good evening to everyone. And I hope you can tell by my accent that I'm not dissimilar or unknowing around the game of rugby. Grew up with the game in England, and I've been living in Canada since January 1990, and quite involved at the NSO level with various projects over the years. I'm going to show you some slides. You will be able to have a PDF copy of these slides. We'll make sure those get sent out to you after the fact. I'm going to go through them very rapidly. You know, I'm quite abrupt and caustic on this subject, mainly because I have spent my career up until this point in performance sport at the Olympic and world level, and mainly for Canada in the Winter Olympic sports. But I have had some cursory dealings with some of the summer sports, but I have little patience when it comes to organizations dealing with kids and youth. And I'm going to make some very, very pointed comments. I don't expect you to agree with everything I say, but fortunately on my side, I do have a gargantuan amount of research and world evidence around what happens to young humans as they grow over the first 2 decades of life. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just get on with this. So, okay, so let me just get this bit out of the way. Sorry, I need to get this disappeared. There we go. So I've called it player and participant development because I think we all need to understand that we are absolutely in an area that grows the game for us, and we want as much participation as we can. In fact, for me, a hallmark metric for you is that as kids start, at whatever point they start the exposure to rugby in this country, is that at the very least, you want to try and ensure that those participants that start with you at whatever the ages are, sort of, I don't know, 6 through to 8, let's say that you still have them with you, at least as they exit high school at 18. And if you've done that and they can answer in the following manner to the over 10 years that they've been involved with your organizations, and they can say, you know what, as they look back on that age group experience and say, I learned a lot and I had a great time, then you've done your job largely, if they can answer those 2 questions. And one of the key things for me is, do you actually ask people why they stay with rugby? Why do they leave rugby if they're imminently jettisoning their relationship with you? And as they sort of move on to the next stages of their lives, or even the next stage of rugby, you know, what is their view looking back always? And I think that's very important for you. And there's this great quote from Wells Coates a number of years ago. He was the inventor of the sort of modern foundation of the transistor radio. And he said this: we must remember that the past is not always behind us, but more often in front of us, blocking our way. Now, rugby has a great tradition, and we should not devalue that tradition. But at times, tradition and the way we've always done things is not the best as we move forward. So we've got to play that game where we embrace our traditions and value them, but we have to move with the times, and particularly where we have an evidence-based approach or a block of information that shows us about doing things more effectively, more efficiently, and with greater purpose. So I want you to remember that quote. The other thing is, and this is where I'm going to come at you all very hard, volunteerism is not an excuse for poor performance. So here we are sitting in 2022, and a group of us 2 decades ago wrote a pop science document for Sport Canada around this very subject. And I would argue that in many areas and with many sports, we've not moved the marble forward. And one of those areas is to do with, we just have not got pertinent information into the hands of our clubs, our volunteer coaches, our volunteer administrators effectively enough. And I would remind you that to really affect change and actually have a system that starts to work, there are sort of 4 stages. You have to have the initial, if you like, campaign, if you like, the initiative. You have to have all the education that goes along with that. And we're very good in Canada at doing those first 2 things. I mean, look at participation. It's actually a great initiative, and there's lots of good information, and we all know who Hal and Joanne are and all this type of stuff. But they were never tasked with actually, say, the next 2 stage, which is basically implementation and the metrics to actually do something about physical activity. And then, of course, the accountability framework. So here we are 50 years or so down this particular road. We spent millions of dollars on participation. And one of the original reasons was to try and actually get the average Canadian to be at least as fit as the average 65-year-old Scandinavian. And yet every year we still get a D- on physical activity in our children, youth, and adults. So what I want to make sure here is that we really actually implement things. We put pertinent information into the hands of all our volunteers, and they understand what they're doing. You've got lots of information. That's on the left-hand side of the screen is front cover of the 2008 long-term rugby development model, if you like, which is readily available. You can print that thing down, you can look at it online. And if you go to Rugby Canada's site, you'll see this overall sort of 1-pager that shows you the overall structure. Doesn't tell you the content. And as with many things, it sort of defaults largely to a competition structure. And I would remind you that, to be quite blunt, any idiot can design overall a competition structure, put together a competition calendar, but that tells you nothing about the quality of the content of the programming, because that does take expertise and understanding, and particularly age appropriateness in terms of that programming. However, that's a very harsh thing for me to say. This is a good basis for you to move on. So you have lots of material at your fingertips. You move on to Rookie Rugby, which has been, I think, a pretty good branding success, and there's lots of information for you. There are lots of tentacles into different areas, from schools to communities to clubs themselves. And we mustn't forget that whilst we may have a rather, opinionated view that rugby clubs are the be-all and end-all, don't forget that if you really drive good relationships into your communities, into the schools, as other sports have done, and I will point at golf, both in Canada and the United States, as having done very good jobs in this area, you mustn't discount those type of strategic partnerships, particularly where participation is concerned. And then when you go to World Rugby, they've even got a whole series of modules around long-term player development. And I just pulled off this particular page from their website that shows the LTPD particular pathway in the various modules. So there is lots of information that's available to you. And ultimately what you're wanting to do as both provincial sections, each club, even if there are multiple clubs in a particular metropolis, you're trying to make sure that your sport and your organization stands out from the myriad of other organizations that kids can be attracted to. Because if we're going to stand here and say you're going to live and die by your participation numbers, you've got to get and attract youngsters into your sport and retain them when there's lots and lots of choice. And often lots and lots of choice where they don't have to sweat, hurt, put any physical activity or any thought into things. Okay, so they're going to almost default away from the type of offering you have, unless you understand why kids and why youth come back week in, week out, or where you have a break in the season and you've got to really sort of vamp them and bring them back at the start of the sort of next preparatory phase of your season. So you really need to understand that game and understand which metrics are very important for you. And one of those is certainly the sort of how do you capture kids? How do you get them to enter into your sport in the first place? And how do you keep them coming back? And therefore you have to understand the role of challenging yet fun environments if you're going to keep the interest of youngsters between 5 through to 20 with you. You have to understand what's your primary purpose. What are you trying to do? Is it you're going to try and have a group that's going to win the next meaningless age group competition? And I'm being harsh with you because I do not care who wins at 10 and 12 and 14 and 16 and even 18 years of age. These are meaningless concepts. There is no such thing for anyone that's truly interested in performance as a 10-year-old champion or 12-year-old champion. And there's loads and loads of evidence around this. Just even the stats of the age group champions who convert to senior performance. So if you look at both genders, virtually every sport, 85 to 96% of the age group champions are not the people that win at the senior or performance level. Don't believe me? Look at sports where they even actually have their world junior championships at relatively late ages. If you look at track and field, athletics across the world, their world championships is at 19 years and under. Now, at 18 to 19 years, physically, you can virtually have a full-on adult physique in both genders almost, right? And yet, you know, the conversion of the medalists from the world junior track and field to the world or Olympic level in track and field is 4%. 4%. And that's in a sport where the gestation from the end of the juniors to the senior ranks is relatively small, relatively short. So what I'm trying to say to you is that, you know, these meaningless baubles and trophies that are bigger than the participants themselves, you know, we're starting to do these things almost for adult entertainment. And yet we're really needing to understand that this journey of humans affects all of us. And I've shown, you know, silhouettes here of males, obviously, and because I didn't want to get into trouble in this day and age of showing maybe female silhouettes. So I've shown the males, and we're interested in rugby from that sort of second one from the left through to probably, you know, the sort of recognizable athletic figure that's 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one from the left. Okay, that's our developmental period of time, and you immediately recognize that those silhouettes are basically demonstrating to you actually different humans. If you're really astute, the skull size, the head size of the infant through the sort of first decade and a half of life is quite different compared to the fully formed male. Kids and infants have much larger heads, reflecting the massive development of the brain in the first 2 decades of life, and particularly in the first decade and a half. And then the physique changes as certain hormonal components come into effect to help effect change. And so what you're needing to understand is what is on the dashboard of developmental rugby for those sort of 6 to 8 year olds, and then from the 9 through the 12-year-olds, and then the 12 through to the 15-year-olds, and so forth. And they're quite different. And I'm going to show you some information as to why that is true. The next thing you need to understand, and you almost need this hashtag, if you're dealing with children and youth, understand it's their lives, not yours. We're facilitating them. If you are a coach of 8-year-olds, one of your primary responsibilities is to help them get ready to be 9. And if you're dealing with 12-year-olds, getting them ready to be 13 and so forth. We're in a conveyor belt, and our job is to facilitate their development in the time that we actually have with them. And remember, it's not that gargantuan a time. It's not even a whole year, because you only see them perhaps at certain weeks of the year for a few hours. And yet you have to have great influence on them, and not simply in the game of rugby, but their value system, how they treat each other, how they communicate, how they develop in those type of things, how they look after the equipment, how they deal with officials, all these elements that are tied up in emotional intelligence. And that brings me back to this concept of the dashboard. And dashboards have taken a bit of a bad rap recently, but I like them. So what is on the dashboard of the coach of a group of 12-year-olds in rugby? what is he or she trying to do with that group? What are the primary things that he or she is working on? And remember, this dashboard comes after the dashboard from the previous year. And the dashboard is evolving into what it will become for the next year as they develop and acquire new skills, for example. Now, this particular diagram is just the synopsis of the long-term athlete development pathway in Canada, sometimes known as LTAD. And there are two broad elements to this. There's the early years before the sort of pubertal growth spurt, where you're trying to build an overall physical literacy, no different than reading, writing, and arithmetic in age group sport, in school, for example. And so we're trying to build some fundamental movement skills, and then from, basically running, jumping, throwing, kicking, striking, gradually moving those type of things into the elements that are important as building blocks for a particular sport or family of sports. So, for example, unless you can run, unless you can move in all sorts of directions, unless you can actually deal with perhaps your mates hanging off you as you're trying to run, you're not going to be able to play rugby. If you can't pass the ball, if you can't throw it, if you can't catch it, if you can't kick it, if you don't understand the dynamics of that ball because of its shape, then these fundamental skills that you're building are not going to be able to be evolved as you move into the next stage up. And so you have this sort of 6 stages of elements from active start, which may or may not involve rugby in a recognizable form, but through the fundamentals all the way through to if a player is capable of reaching the high performance sport, and understand where that is occurring. There may be anomalies because of some virtue, like maybe they are a bit physically bigger than their peer groups, that they can be moved through the system at a slightly faster rate. But understand this, there's the challenge. If you start to move people and you think you're giving them a greater advantage, understand what they then miss. And one of the problems often with early specialization is that it actually leads to early exclusion of other activities or other skills. So there's always a choice in the process. It's arguable as whether or not there is an active for life stage per se in rugby, or whether you are simply building good athletic people that understand the importance of physical activity. And as they basically retire from what is a very demanding sport, they're going to actually choose other activities that are a little bit kinder to themselves, both physically, emotionally, and physically. And therefore, I question whether rugby is a sport for life per se in terms of its participation. But if you're grounding them in understanding things as looking after themselves physically, emotionally, etc., looking after their nutrition, and building some basic skills, then you're going to allow them greater choice to do other things. You could draw that a different way. Here's the first 2 decades of life. You gradually go from sort of a participatory model to a recreationally competitive model to those that might get into some kind of performance development, and then leading on into the early stages of high performance sport, even though that's at a relatively young age, your junior teams, etc., and your provincial teams that may come in at that stage. Pretty simple stuff, but we kind of ignore this in our rush to pretend that everyone's in elite sport. I mean, right now in the winter months, if I live in Calgary or just outside of Calgary, if I drive into Calgary on the weekend, I guarantee there will be a high performance elite program for 7-year-olds in hockey somewhere in Calgary on Saturday morning. Well, the only thing that should be high performance or elite is actually the standard of coaching relevant to 7-year-olds, because the 7-year-olds certainly aren't elite or high performance, if you understand what I'm saying. And we get it a bit ass backwards. This is why our coaches, whether they're volunteers or not, are so important in this overall process. You've probably seen diagrams like this. This green blocks is basically trying to say to you that this is the entire potential population in rugby. And we go from cradle to, or you might not see that, but at the top it would say grave, okay? And on the left right-hand side, you've got ages from 0 to 75. So on the left-hand side, cradle to grave, it actually says, I've got my sort of control pod out of the way, but I didn't. And then the key thing is you need to understand that everyone starts. So you have a column that's to do with start, okay? And in rugby, we don't tend to have people starting relatively late in life. So the starting phase in rugby is relatively early. We then want to try and convert people to stay with rugby for as long as possible, no matter what their sort of performance level, because they can play recreational, they can play a tiered level of competitive rugby, male rugby, whatever it might be. And there are versions of the game from full contact to no contact if necessary. And then finally, we have a very thin group, which is our succeed, if you like, tier. And so what we're gradually trying to do over time, if we stratify that by age now, we're trying to develop a roadmap where kids start, we capture them into the stay programs and gradually develop them. We have a cohort that may gradually move into a more competitive stream in the succeed stream, but the lifespan in the succeed stream is relatively short. I've shown it possibly into the late 30s, and then hopefully maybe even that group come back into the stay sort of mass participation recreational stream. But the vast majority of players will basically stay in the stay stream. And so you might want to ask yourself in your club, if you look at each of the sort of blocks, so the 0 to 10 group in the start, the 0 to 10 in the stay, the 10 years of age to 20 in the stay group, what are the types of programs in each of these little sort of rectangles that your club could actually offer? And perhaps in the stay from 50 years and up, maybe that's social. Maybe it's getting back involved in some type of administrative role or fundraising or whatever it might be, but you're still involving them in the game, but perhaps in different ways. So it's almost a bit of a roadmap to ask yourself, what are our programs in each of these areas? If you were a sport where you had multiple age groups entering the game, in the start column, you can actually ask yourself, well, what about people trying to get into rugby between 20 and 40? There may not be a lot, but maybe there's kids certainly between 10 to 20 that could get into the game. And maybe there's a group of the university crowd and college crowd that could start into rugby. When I first came to Canada, rugby clubs at universities were actually starting to evolve a little bit. They weren't playing at a particularly high level, but it was amazing that they were attracting people into the intramural game, at a fairly high rate. Well, that's another participatory group. These could be some of your coaches or volunteers, or perhaps even your parents of the future. So all I'm trying to say here is there are different elements that you might want to focus on from starting to the stay to whatever. And I think a fundamental aspect for all of you is to understand the difference between lead and lag metrics. Most of the parents will focus on the lag metrics. Most of the media interviews that you'll give will want to know about the performance of your kids and your teams and all this type of stuff. And they don't understand that they're all the lead metrics that actually result in the final outcome. And so you in the club structure need to understand, well, what do you need to do first? What are the things that you need to be able to do to actually play the game of rugby? And at what ages do you need to actually establish those things and advance them forward? Which comes back to this: world-class coaching for each age group, maybe even world leading. And the difference between world leading and world class is basically world leading is almost a mentality where you're continually trying to improve. Okay, how is your club better this year than it was last year at whatever you're doing, particularly in the area of coaching? And so the ongoing lifelong learning, the taking of modules, upgrading of knowledge is important. Next thing is really, what are your scouting reports? Again, on your dashboard of your kids, what are you really looking for? Add each of the age groups, each of the pods. And so remember, a scouting report is well supported by the sports science. It's not simply about what is your sprint speed, what is your deadlift in the gym. It's really about getting a group of coaches that understand the game and understand the age group you're talking about, and having a sort of common consensus of the group of players in front of them, who's ahead of the curve, who's the middle of the average, if you like, who's a little bit behind the curve at that moment in time, and what are the key things on that dashboard. Understand the difference between early exposure and versus early specialization. In terms of development, you're going to come across those who develop early versus the average versus the late. In performance, exactly the same. Who are the ones that show performance levels early? And maybe it's to do with the fact that they're 6 inches taller, or 10 kilograms heavier than their peer group, whatever it might be, and understand and recognize these things and not simply look at the lag metric. Now I'm going to show you some boring stuff very quickly. Along the bottom, the first 2 decades of life, okay, basically 2 years of age to 22. On vertical scale, you got a percentage score where 100% is the adult final state. So the first one is the neural development curve. This is basically brain weight, brain size. So you can see in the first decade and a half, the brain size increases massively as the brain is stimulated. The young human is stimulated by all the different stimuli that are coming into it once it's come out of the womb, right? And this includes all the things that you're doing with kids: pressure sensitivity, how to catch the ball, how to throw the ball with the right weight, etc., how to change direction, some of the early rules, not the whole World Cup rules, the early rules. And then you gradually see a plateauing of the brain as it starts to ruthlessly cull those pathways it doesn't use that often. And just like the energy systems, then you see that the brain builds a capacity first, and then over the next 60 to 70 years, you build a power to the brain. The brain starts to learn how to use all these sort of pathways you've developed. It's almost the internet of the body, basically, okay? And gradually, as you go through that first decade of life, you move from dial-up to 5G and faster, right? So that's the view. It's also another reason why, as I said, why little kids have big heads initially in relation to the size of their bodies. The brain has grown preferentially very quickly. Compared to this line, this is the change in the hormonal and the influence of the hormonal system. And in this case, particularly the male hormone testosterone, present in both males and females, but obviously in a much higher circulating level of capability in males. But it's trending along at a relatively low level until once you get past that sort of pubertal spurt into that period in and around, not gender specific, sort of 12 to 15 years of age. And then it starts to take off and you start to see the appearance of the secondary sexual characteristics. You see the ability of young humans to put on muscle mass, hypertrophy. Before this, kids will naturally get a little bit stockier, let's say, put on some muscle mass as they grow. But the real stimulus for that muscle mass comes once testosterone really becomes a little bit more freely available. So there's no point doing big strength training programs with a bunch of prepubescents. How they get stronger is actually by using their brain and the information pathways and the communication pathways to use their bodies more effectively. And then gradually over time, you can bring in more advanced and more senior strength training to take advantage of building muscle mass, which means that the overall growth curve in humans is sigmoidal. Big lot of growth in those initial years, up to around sort of 6 or so, then a relatively stable plateau until you really get to that big pubertal growth spurt, and then all hell breaks loose for a few years, and you just have to live with the fog until it starts to stabilize in the late teenage years. Is that clear? This should actually scream at you as a basic template for your rugby programs that early on, you're teaching skills first and foremost. You're also teaching quickness because it's neurally controlled, right? You always look for fast kids, but you can also help them along. And when I mean speed, I'm talking about the sort of drop dead speed, the 0 to about 4 seconds and the 0 to 10 seconds, those type of efforts. I'm not talking about the lactate system, okay, the anaerobic glycolytic system, because believe it or not, until you get to about just past the growth spurt, those enzymatic pathways that are involved in that system, which is so important for the eventual senior game, are really not very well developed. Kids are very aerobic and very explosive. They just don't have that middle ground per se. Okay, is that very clear? So this should basically scream at you lots and lots of different activities, lots and lots of skill, and then gradually over time you move a little bit more to the physicality. You can then also use the brain to deal with more advanced tactics. No point teaching, you know, the All Blacks defensive system to a bunch of 10 to 12-year-olds. They just won't get it. Okay, so keep it simple. It's another reason why the rules should gradually adapt over time so that the hardest, the most challenging, the most restricting game that you have to try and solve the problem for is the senior game. And up until that point, you gradually impose more and more rules to constrict them, to constrain them, to make the game more difficult, but not when they're really young. You just want the basic shape, if you like, of the game. And this next one, same 2 decades of life on the bottom, and I'm going pretty quick here. This graph actually shows you things that are all changing. It's just at the top of the red arrow, we're going to be looking at change in height over the first couple of decades of North American kids and youth. At the top, it's about 15 centimeters a year. That's the change. And in the middle part, about 7 centimeters a year, and down towards the bottom, about 2 to 3 centimeters. So you're looking at change over time in height. And in females in North America, it roughly looks like that. So it's not a nice smooth curve because I wasn't able to control my mouse with my hand that well. Okay, but you get the idea. So in the first couple of years, you can see there's rapid growth. Okay, massive growth that gradually slows until about the age of 2 or 3. Then it gradually sort of peters out. Not that there's no growth, because remember, this is change over time, but it's just relatively stable until about, in females, the age of 10 or 11. And then you get this sudden rise occur. And this is the onset of the pubertal growth spurt. And it rises to a peak. And that peak is known as peak height velocity, PHV, the greatest rate of change in height in a calendar year, which in North American girls is about 12 to 13 years of age, plus or minus a year or so. And then gradually, as the growth plates close of the long bones, the bones of the legs and the arms, obviously height starts to slow again, and you start to dissipate down until finally you reach your adult height. Okay, is that very clear to you? North American boys, and you don't need me to tell you this, it's the same sort of pattern, but they develop a little bit later. They also have a higher peak. So it's pretty clear that if we were looking at the average girl at age 11 versus the average boy at 11, you could probably know that the girls are tending to be taller than the boys. The only thing that then starts to happen is the rate of change for the boys takes off massively. So in the end, they catch up and surpass the height of the girls. And actually that spread under that peak tends to go on for a bit longer. And so they start to grow rapidly at around, say, age 12 in general. And if they reach their peak height velocity at about 14 years of age, plus or minus a year on average. And there are going to be kids ahead of that curve, kids behind that curve, kids that don't necessarily have a massive spike, but they have a sort of longer sort of growth period over several years. Okay, but in general, this is what happens. Next, the dotted lines refer to peak bone mass. This is very important because you can see that the peak bone mass change happens after the growth spurt. So in other words, the kids are grown lengthwise, but their bones are actually quite brittle. This is why the American College of Pediatrics and the Canadian Academy of Sport Medicine get on the case of sports where there is high impact or collision rates in these certain areas. That's why certain sports have even changed some of their rules, even hockey, for example, around hitting, because there's a fracture window that the kids are naturally set up for, in this period. Okay, so the bones are quite brittle, okay, and then gradually they strengthen over time. And guess what? One of the most important things for that strengthening of bone, and you're going to say, oh, Steve, yeah, it's calcium and diet. Well, those are supporting aspects, but the reality actually is loading forces on the skeletal system. So being active, and particularly multi-activity, not unidimensional activity, builds strong bones. And this is very unfortunate for us in Canada, because if you look at the participation rates in sport and the fact that phys ed is almost useless, sorry to any phys ed teachers, we've allowed that to become marginalized so much in a high school. We know that girls drop out of sport like lemons at age 13, just when they should be trying to build strong, strong bones. And guess what happens? 5, 6 decades after this particular diagram, it is no wonder we run into massive issues to do with osteoporosis, because the girls haven't developed strong bones in particular. And all that happens once they get into their 20s and on into their 30s is there's a gradual decline in the bone density in our females in particular. And it's happening actually more and more in males too. So you get the idea? This period here with the green block, this is a very important period for developing skills, doing lots of different sports, but also learning all the fundamental skills for just general physical activity, skills certainly for rugby, because there are some important skills that need to be developed in rugby. Why is this period important? Well, think of it. There's not that much change physically happening to the kids. They're not being hit hard by the hormonal changes yet, and their height is relatively constant year on year. Oh, sorry, the change in height is relatively constant year on year on year, right? And it's only after this period that all hell breaks loose. But you can imagine this next orange bar, this is often where we're making big decisions for these kids, selecting them to teams and saying, oh, you're crap, go away, that type of stuff, and ridiculous sort of value systems. And yet, you have no idea what's going on in here. You're not comparing apples with apples through these massive change periods. You're comparing apples with oranges, with bananas, with kiwi fruit, with God knows what else during this melee. And so you actually have to have great patience. This is where tiering, perhaps, for competition is very important, because you can mix and match as long as there's replicage. So a kid isn't assigned to a particular level of play forevermore in that first year of change. The other things are the things that you can't see. So this shows brain development from 5 years of age on the left-hand side to 20 years of age. And as the brain goes from yellows and greens to more of the indigos, this is showing the maturing of the brain. And so below the black line, you're looking at the front of the brain is the top of the brain diagram. And on above the black line, the front of the brain is to the right. And you'll notice that one of the phases that really develops fairly late on is the area at the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. This is so important for things like decision-making, timekeeping, respecting rules and authority, all the type of things that teenagers don't have that we as adults hate. But it's because they haven't developed these areas yet. So you need to understand that even though you might see a young man in front of you, you need to really have the conversation with them and watch them in a number of situations to understand where their brain development has got to. And then there's two final graphs I really want to show you. I'm sorry I'm prattling on here. You've got a decade of life from 11 to about 22 here. You've got a percentage scale. And I'm just going to show you, this is a bunch of Russian kids that were tracked over time who were just allowed to grow. They didn't do any extra type of physical activity other than normality. And you're going to see the change in certain characteristics that are very important for physical activity and performance later on. So this is the line of development, or sorry, change in aerobic power per year. So this is VO2 max. So you can see that between about 14 and 16 years of age, there is a very high level of change in aerobic power. Every year it's improving, but in that particular phase. Well, why is that? Well, no wonder. Remember the growth curves? They're growing at the greatest rate here. So their lungs are getting bigger, their muscle mass is getting bigger, the blood volume is getting bigger. So it's no wonder that their aerobic power goes up. And then gradually, as those dimensions start to slow, unless you actually did a whole bunch of training, you're not necessarily going to hold to massive changes in that. So there's a natural bias in the way the kids are developing. And I'm going to show you these other lines very quickly. These are all the ones to do with the anaerobic components. So anaerobic capacity, the B with the sort of brackets, and LA is blood lactate. So little kids can't produce much blood lactate. They have to get through puberty, develop the enzymatic pathways to use that particular pathway. The anaerobic capacity, which is very important in playing rugby at the highest level, starts to improve as well. So you can see kids very aerobic, and then gradually with some of the hormonal changes and the changes in muscle mass, they get a little bit more anaerobic. That's just natural. And then this one, this is classic Canadian work by Molina and Bouchard. All they did here is they basically had kids pull on a steel cable with a tensionometer, okay? And as they grew from 12 years of age to 19 years of age, and then using x-rays to determine early versus average versus late maturers, okay, they plotted the line. And you can see that the early maturers have the advantage early on in strength, okay? And their curve comes up like so forth. And then the average ones from the late maturers are, you know, they suck for a few years and then finally they catch up. And actually, if you look at the trajectory of that curve, and it's borne out by later studies, you'll see that the later maturers often surpass the performance level of the early maturers. Interesting, huh? And yet often as not, if you want to win at age 15, and this is a particular metric that you're interested in, static strength, guess which line of players you tend to choose? You'll choose the ones on the orange line, right? And you'll actually discriminate against the sort of weaker kids on the green line. And yet later on, when it really starts to count, if they're still in the game, they're right there with your better players. Okay, going to wrap up here. You've seen these type of pictures. In those particular growth segments where I said you're comparing apples with oranges and kiwi fruit, God knows what. Here's two 13-year-old girls. One's a young woman and one's a little kid still. If we understand growth and development and boys developing a bit later, let's look at 14-year-old boys. You've got a young man and a little boy. And understand, I've chose these age groups and these radically different youngsters to get this point to you. During those periods of rapid growth, you know, as you head towards peak height velocity, even though they may be the same calendar year, this is why age group sport is so challenging, one of the most difficult coaching jobs on the planet. In that singular calendar year, okay, you can have easily a 48-month biological spread. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you could have a bunch of 14-year-old boys, but some of them are biologically 12 and some of them are actually 16 in the same year of birth. Very difficult. And particularly if you're then thinking that the only lag metric you're interested in is performance, because you're going to go down a red herring pathway if that's the way you're viewing things. Here's three 14-year-old gymnasts. Who do you think's winning right now? Well, look at that guy on the right. He's like Adonis compared to the little guy on the left. Little guy on the left can't even get on the pommel horse. So, you know, he's going to get in the car to go home with his parents, and his parents are going, oh my God, I'm spending $200 a month for you to do gymnastics. You suck. But he's not there yet. He's a little boy. And actually, maybe he's got the speed and he's actually got the attention and he's got some of the raw skills that once the physicality comes in, he's going to be right there, if not better. The next thing, as I said, involving around long-term player development, you've got to understand that rules and officiating, your officials are part and parcel, as much as the coaches, with understanding long-term athlete and long-term participant development and understanding what type of rules you want for your 8 and unders versus your 12 and unders versus your 16 and unders, and how do you make the game more challenging as they develop both their brains and their physicality. So ultimately, you want to create within your clubs an enjoyable approach that is still challenging, because kids, they will tell you all the time, all the research, they want to be challenged, but they want it to be enjoyable. And remember, fun is what brings them back session after session, week in, week out. And if you look at the team sport research in North America, it's pretty conclusive that kids would far rather play on a losing team, okay, than sit on the bench or be a sub on a winning team, because they value the participation and actually doing. And ultimately, we're trying to create active, skilled, imaginative, resourceful, and resilient kids. That's our goal. I had the great fortune of working with Mike Babcock around Team Canada Hockey around our successful Olympics. And he always said, even though you might think he was old-fashioned and a hardcore, but he really lived this. We build the human first, the athlete second, and in his case, the hockey player third. But for us, the rugby player third. We build good humans, great athletes, and phenomenal rugby players. And remember, if we do our great job around this, these kids that we're developing over the 15 years or so, we have them up until about the age of 20, aside from the fact that some of them will go on to perhaps represent the province, represent the country, et cetera, all the levels, they're likely to be the parents of the future, the coaches of the future, the administrators of the future, and perhaps even the sponsors of the future. So thanks very much. I know I've taken up quite a bit of time, but I really wanted to get these to you. I'm going to give you a copy of the slides through as a PDF later on. And if I will always be here as a resource for you. There's some contact information. I'll make sure you have a copy of that. And I'll shut up now. Okay.
Okay, wow, fantastic. I mean, I'm actually happy you went over. I was just cheering and loving everything you were saying. So, we're gonna quickly take a 5-minute breakout room just to discuss some of the great stuff we just heard. And so, a question to ponder would be: what actions will you take away to target athletes / participants at the different age groups in each of the start, stay, and succeed streams that Stephen had talked about tonight? I thought this one might drag, but thanks, Stephen got us going.
I don't think 5 minutes to unpack any of that was but
What happened now? I was in a session and it went.
It's rapid fire night. Rapid fire night. We got to do this quick.
If that lady's back, I just want to say she was talking about girls in Winnipeg, and I just want to say,
yeah, it's Liz. Thanks.
Understanding that the social dynamic for females, well supported by the research, is absolutely critical. That, you know, and the sense of belonging. So it's no wonder, and the challenge you get when you don't have a critical mass to make a team. So you've got to look to other ways of being creative to hold them, because the social interaction for the young girls is really probably the glue that's holding them to you. And so you've got to find ways of getting through those phases where perhaps you haven't got the numbers necessarily, or joining forces with other activities to keep them engaged from a social point of view, because that's often why that what's really holding them. And you're not unusual in that. It's even in the individual sports that's the same. So it's you're right, that period of time where they're literally like lemmings falling out of the activities is crucial. And we as adults have got to understand the dynamic that's important for them.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen.
Okay, here we go. So next up, we got Ryan Jones to follow that. I can't wait how it goes. It's going to be awesome, but tough one to follow. But here's Ryan, our Rugby Canada development guru.
Awesome. I've shared a screen. Just give me a quick thumbs up. We can see that, and it's the right thing. Excellent.
Oh, looking great.
Definitely a tough act to follow. I feel like I've been set up for this one, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ryan Jones, Rugby Development Manager with Rugby Canada. So my role is really to help the growth and development of rugby across the country. And before I get started, just want to acknowledge that the land I'm on today is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabeg, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Certainly a space that I'm learning in right now, and I'm really trying to understand what meaning that has to me in connecting to the Indigenous lands. But hopefully we could take some time to reflect at some stage on that space if we can. So my chat tonight really is around why youth rugby. I think for me, and you'll see, I'll share a little bit about my story, my pathway. You'll see that in a lot of spaces there isn't youth rugby, or if there is, it's not as big as maybe it should be. So I'm going to try my best to keep on time. I know I've been cut a little bit, but we'll start with a bit of an activity. So we want to talk about why youth rugby. So we'll call this a waterfall. So I want you to get the chat open and have it set to everybody, and be prepared to, when I say go, type in it 3 to 5 words, a reason why youth rugby is important to you or to your community. Okay, so I'll give us about 30 seconds to type a few things. Put a semicolon if you've got a couple things, but I just want you to think about why youth rugby is important to you, and then we should get a flood of pieces. Awesome. Okay, go ahead. It's happening already. So inclusive, fun, development of physical literacy and better people, keeps rugby alive for my kids, future of the sport, pass on knowledge, fitness, fun, inclusive, mental and physical health. It's a fun game you enjoyed as a kid. It's a game for all shapes, all sizes. Awesome. So for me, and again, you'll see this a little bit later on, rugby got me to where I am today, and made me the person that I am today. And without youth rugby, I wouldn't be here. And I think just listening to the last presentation from Stephen, I certainly live in that sort of participate space. I didn't go to performance. I played for the provincial team in Manitoba, and that's the highest level I played in. And youth rugby and rugby in general gave me a lot. So from my perspective, there are sort of three big pieces why we should be putting youth rugby in our spaces. So one is the pathway. So we've got our national teams, and we've got youth who are excited to be on this pathway, excited to become the best that they can be. And without the exposure to the sport early on, we're leaving it potentially a bit too late to develop those skills. And obviously recognizing that playing multiple sports is extremely important as well. That exposure to rugby isn't happening. And if we can expose youth to rugby early on, they become fans of the game, they become excited about the game, they become a part of our community. And so that's something for me, I'm really passionate about that space and being a part of the community, and potentially getting them on a pathway if that's what they want to do. Another piece from your club's perspective, it's a potential sponsorship and sort of money generating opportunity for you. Now, ideally, any money that's being made from junior and youth rugby is being put back into junior and youth rugby, but it opens up doors to sponsorships, connections to different people, different community groups, who could help you and expand your club and your space and your environment. And finally, I think the most important piece for me is that connection. And rugby, as all of us know on this call, is one of the best sports. It is the best sport in the world to connect to community. I believe it's the only sport that you can get on a plane tomorrow, land anywhere in the world, knock on the front door of a rugby club and be welcomed. They'll find you a place to stay. They'll find you a job. They'll find you anything that you need. They'll help you and they'll support you, and vice versa. We'll do that for them here. So giving kids that experience, that opportunity to experience rugby and experience that culture and that environment is extremely important, extremely important. And if we don't have that space for them to play, then we potentially lose them. They potentially don't get that opportunity. So building and creating those spaces, extremely important. So I want to talk through my pathway a little bit and talk about how I got to where I am. And I as I speak about it, I'm not trying to kind of show everything that I've done in my life and brag or anything like that. But I want you to think about your story and your connection to sport, potentially other sports, or to rugby, and how you got to where you are today. So we hear the stories about the Olympians, the national teams, and all that, but we don't necessarily hear about the other stories that produce successful people. So I started with the Melksham Rugby Club. We were the Melksham Cats, and so I played youth rugby there. And then when I was 10 years old, I moved to Canada, and the only option to play rugby was in high school. So I went to Springfield Collegiate and played high school rugby at Springfield. But there was no option for me between the ages of 10 to 14 to play rugby. And potentially, I potentially could have dropped out of the sport if high school rugby wasn't the option for me. And I might not be where I am today if it wasn't for that. Then I joined the Winnipeg Wasps Rugby Club, which opened up different avenues and different doors for me, playing for the provincial team. And then I started to coach and referee, so a different pathway in there as well. And with the provincial team, I was one of the 25 lucky male players in 2009 that got to play 11 months of rugby. I had the opportunity to play junior rugby, and there was only 25 of us that got that experience, that got the experience to travel to Ireland, that got the experience to travel to PEI. And I reflect back now and think, what about the rest? If there was club rugby, could there have been 5 or 6 tours traveling to different parts of the world? Could there have been different experiences for different youth in that time if club rugby had happened? And then I joined Rugby Manitoba as the youth development officer. Again, an opportunity I got through rugby, through my connections, through the game, which then led to Rugby Ontario, where I'm now in a whole bunch of different spaces, playing for a great club, the Oshawa Vikings, for a number of years. I coached at the provincial program, the Ontario Blues, which led to university team, coaching university team, where the connection there led me to the Bay Street Pigs, who don't have a logo online available, so that'll be the best I can do for you on that. And then I sat on the board for Toronto City Rugby Club and became an educator for World Rugby on the coaching stream, which then led to Rugby Canada, and now my passion for youth sport and filling that gap in rugby that I saw when I was a kid. I'm also doing a part-time master's in positive youth development at York University. So the point of this picture here is to say, I don't think I'd be where I am if I didn't have youth rugby at 10 years old. And I potentially could have lost it if there wasn't rugby in my high school. So if in our clubs, in our communities, we can build programs and create opportunities for kids to play and participate, the next person in my seat could be here, the next CEO of a major company could come from your club, from your environment. And I think if we can provide that opportunity, and we can provide kids with an opportunity to have a great experience, have fun, and potentially progress on in life using the community and the culture that we have in the sport, I think it's a fantastic opportunity and something we should take on. I know I'm tight on time, but so how do we do this? Together. And I really want to emphasize this. We all need to be pulling in the same direction. I know in each province there's different focus points, but each province, especially in the prairies, they've committed to youth rugby. They've committed to developing rugby. They've got full-time development officers there to support the rugby clubs, and working with them, working together, bringing clubs together in the same space to talk about how we're going to develop youth rugby, how we're going to bring a youth rugby competition to our environment, whether that's under the age of 12 or if it's at an older age group. That's a great opportunity there. So come together, have the conversations together as a community to grow rugby. And then just a challenge to you. Hopefully we're taking notes. If you do have a notepad, if you have something in front of you, just want you to write down this question. You can answer it now, answer it later. But what steps are you going to take to develop youth rugby in your club or in your environment after this call? We've got a fantastic presentation from Stephen. I know Zach, who I'm passing it to next, will be sharing some really interesting pieces as well. So what steps are you going to take to develop rugby in your space? And that's all I've got. I'll pass it along to Zach right away. Is there an intro? I'll stop the share.
I can intro myself if that's easier.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, might as well go for it, Zach. We're tight on time, so here you go.
Just give me 2. I'm just going to fix my screens up. So my name's Zach Elliott. I work for Rugby Australia in Australia. My background is I came through a Super Rugby franchise here in Australia. So I started at the bottom in administration. I became a development officer. I then became a senior development officer and overlooked and oversaw all the development staff. And now I've taken up a role with Rugby Australia in Active Rugby Hub's program management, which is basically all our participation programs that we work with clubs to try and get as many kids playing rugby as possible. I think there's a little bit of correlation between us and Canada in the fact that you guys have a lot of other team sports that kids like to play, and we have the same. We have rugby league, AFL, soccer here in the winter, as well as tennis and all the other sports. I think you guys have hockey, American football to a certain extent, soccer, and probably a few others that I don't know about. So I'm pretty much not going to show you a presentation. I'm not a big believer in presentations. I'm more of a throw some questions at me as I sort of present, and I can sort of talk about my experiences from my work within the junior clubs and driving that support in junior clubs. So if you've got a particular question or something doesn't make sense or you've got an idea, feel free to throw it at me. So basically, moving forward, I had a quick chat to Pat earlier in the week, and he was just talking about how you guys can sort of drive those participation numbers into your junior clubs. So when I first started in Southern Inland, which is the region of Brumbies, we were at about 500, 600 kids playing rugby across the whole zone, and that was about 14 clubs. After the first year of being there, we sat down as a collective and we made a decision that we're going to drive from the bottom up. So that meant saying that we're sort of going to not let some kids go, but we're going to really focus on that under 6s, under 8s and under 10s age group. And there was a number of reasons for that. And probably the big one was that if we get kids enjoying rugby on a 6, 8 or 10-year-old level, then we're probably going to keep them in the game for longer. And that came off the back of we did a whole of coach education in that space. We made sure that it was an enjoyable environment. So is my microphone dropping in and out? I'm good now. Sorry, bad computer. We started from the bottom and made sure they're really enjoyable. And that enjoyable part of it wasn't just for the kids, it was also for the parents. So if the kids were coming down to train on a Friday night, there was an option there for the parents to have a social occasion. And that social occasion in Australia, generally having a beer or a glass of wine with each other while the kids tear around the field after training. So really driving that social aspect from both the kids level and the parent level is a really important, what we found is a really important part of creating a successful club. If you get parents enjoying going down to rugby, you're going to get the kids down there every day of the week. So yeah, that was probably the main focus within Clubland for us. The other thing is we started to introduce some participation programs, and that's sort of where my job sits now. So we have programs called Get Into Rugby and Touch Sevens. So the Get Into Rugby program is basically aimed at trying to get as many of those new kids in and giving them a taste of rugby that's non-contact to start off with, but has the core skills in rugby. So you catch pass, your evasion, you track to tag and that kind of thing, but it's all done in a really fun and game-led environment. And from there, there's some transition into obviously club football and the teams. But what we've found lately is that clubs have taken that Get Into Rugby program and they'll run it all year. So before a game, they'll do 45 minutes of skills and drills, and then they'll play half an hour, 45 minutes of games. This is quite different to what a lot of traditional sports are doing, where you train during the week and turn up and play on a Saturday. We found that it gives the kids the confidence because they get the opportunity to practice before they play. And then the benefit of it too is that those who are a little bit bigger clubs, they can send kids one way to play contact football, or they can send them another way to play touch sevens, which is our non-contact version of rugby with 7 people on the field. And it allows us has allowed the clubs and us to provide everyone the opportunity to play sport or play rugby and not miss out at all. Any questions moving forward so far? I know you guys have there's been a fair few PowerPoints. Feel free to jump in at any point. I'll open up my chat bar. No, nothing.
Zach, can I jump in? Just one second. Yep. Did you guys get any pushback from changing from the traditional model?
We did a little bit in the start, and there was probably some pushback when we made the decision to go from the ground up. There probably was a little bit of fall away in supporting some of those older age groups, but they saw that if we could work hard for 2 or 3 years to drive that from the bottom up, in 3 years' time, there was going to be 14, 16s kids playing. So it was sort of I don't know what the words are for it, but we had to sort of let some go to the side, but at the same time, we gave those kids opportunities within the Brumbies pathways by putting them in development camps and things like that, other opportunities that probably weren't there. The biggest thing was being open and upfront and honest with what we were trying to do. Staff prior to me were somewhat secretive and hid their agenda. I was very much open and honest and said, this is where we want to be. This is the plan I've got. Can you work with me on this plan? Do you have some thoughts around how this plan can work? Do you want to change anything in the plan? And that was both with the club presidents and then obviously with the general community. So I think the more open and honest you can be, the more buy-in you'll get, and the more buy-in you get, the more support you get. So I think there was just a question that came through on the chat. I was going to ask some questions, especially since rugby is such an important cultural icon for sport in Australia. Yeah, I guess, and that's probably the thing, is that every member union is probably here is a little bit different. We've like the bigger states in ACT, New South Wales, Queensland, probably have more traditional, where your South Australia, your Tasmania and your Northern Territories have gone down the non-traditional paths. I know, for example, Tasmania do everything backwards. So their representative season, when they take rep players away, is the start of the year, and then they work the other way into, obviously, club rugby into participation at the back end, purely do target and get around some of the other major sports. Tyler, you got a question?
Yeah, Zach, what kind of stuff did you do with the parents to keep them involved and engaged at the training sessions?
So I opened up the coach education side of things to a lot of them. There was quite often a lot of fathers who were somewhat keen to be a part of it but didn't know how to. So we ran like a coaching kids course or a level 1. And then the other side of it was having the social side on the sideline. So the mothers could come down and have a chat and have a glass of wine. There was a club that each week a different age group was responsible for cooking dinner or providing food for the end of the training session. So one week it might be a sausage sandwich. These were big farming communities, so a lot of the time it was some kind of quite nice lamb chops or slow cooked beef or something like that. So visiting these training sessions was quite nice as well. But then post-training, in most city settings, post-training, everyone just rushes off and goes home. In the country, it's sort of treated more as a social. So the dads hang around and have a beer. The kids tend to tear around the football field and play a game of touch football and really create that social thing. Or they go back to a local sponsor's pub, club, or whatever and have a meal. Any other questions? Probably my only other point was that within Canberra, I think, Pat, you know this to a little bit more of an extent, the schools and the clubs started to work together a little bit more probably in the last 3 or 4 years. We've had schools become clubs so that obviously all the school kids can play, but also those kids from outside can play. So, and that brings in teachers who have a PE background. It also helps drive within the school community that active opportunity, and it goes back to that social aspect again, that come Saturday afternoon, school kids can come down and watch their mates, parents are watching. It becomes a bit of a social gathering. Ryan's got a question. There's been some really good mums touch rugby happening here with Provinces. The kids train for an hour while the mums play for 45 minutes and have a drink. Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's a great way to get mums in. There's another club here in Canberra that provides sort of a boot camp style program for parents who want to join in while their kids are training, and that gets the parents fit and healthy too, which in turn can more referees, which is always a positive thing within the community, more coaches, and then obviously it's better for the families because everyone's fit and healthy. But yeah, that's sort of all what I've got for the time being. If you guys want to throw up into some questions, happy to have some curly ones or any questions about Australian rugby and our lack of being able to win lately. Yeah, pretty much open up to the floor. I'll let you guys go, and I know you guys have had a fair bit of information come through tonight. I've still got microphone problems, do I? Can everyone hear me now? Beautiful. Where did I get up to? Pointers on female participation. It's probably one of the harder ones to work with. I think if you can get a core group of young ladies who are enjoying it, word of mouth is key. If the core group isn't enjoying it, then they're not going to say to their friends, come down and take part. The other thing is doing that non-traditional time slots or away from the males. If you can make them feel really comfortable in their surroundings, that's really key. So there was I worked with a group of female students in a school here in Canberra. It was a co-ed school. After the first session where all the boys are watching, I asked to take them completely away. We did some work around our tackling in a closed environment with a high jump mat. So when they were tackling and falling, they felt comfortable. And probably the biggest thing in coaching females is they always want to know the why and the how. If you can be really clear on the why and the how, they will trust you a lot quicker, which in turn means that they'll do what you ask a lot quicker. And probably after coaching both men's and women's, sometimes it's a lot easier to coach girls. If you coached men before, a lot of them just think they know what they're doing. Girls, if you told girls to run around backwards around the oval 6 times with a shirt above their head, they'd probably go and do it. And then when they come back, they'd ask you why and how. That makes you better. So girls will generally try things, and then they want to know the why and the how. Anything else? No, I'm happy for you, Pat, to share my contact details. If anyone wants to reach out, post this chat, I'm happy to chat anytime. I can link you into some other people here in Australia too, whether it's some club people that you can sort of talk to around driving that participation in their clubs. You can sort of tell me about your club, and I can link you in with a club here in Australia who's sort of on the same trajectory as you guys, or got the same issues or problems. Or I can sort of go a little bit higher and get someone else at Rugby Australia to present. I will talk to you guys. Cheers. Thanks, guys. I've got to run because I've got the next one to get to. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Zach. Hopefully we'll be able to send a few touring teams over for the World Cup in 27.
Fingers crossed we get these borders open and I can get out of Australia. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Zach. That was awesome. So moving on, we have Samantha Rogers joining us. So Jordan, I'll let you introduce her, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thank you, Samantha, for joining us this evening. So Samantha is the co-founder of Relate Social Capital, and she really specializes in sport philanthropy and sort of alumni relations, engaging alumni. So we're going to have her sort of wrap up this evening's session with some ideas and some experiences from her work.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, that's it. That's me. I'm Sam. I'm based in Montreal, and same thing. I don't have a presentation. I thought it'd be easier to just have a bit more of a conversation. And Jordan and I had a great opportunity to connect and really discuss a couple of important, crucial things with alumni. So happy to sort of give you a bit of an overview and then answer any questions and help, get you set on starting a potential alumni program. Just, of course, given the conversation you've already been having tonight, it's evident how important it is to be able to keep people within the rugby family for as long as possible. And so being able to implement a few little things here or there to be able to have your alumni and community as close as possible for as long as possible will really be beneficial. And knowing that, you know, sport is basically run off the backs of volunteers, it's really important, is making sure that it's as simple and easy as possible. So I don't want to get into a whole big sort of strategy on how to do this. When it comes down to it, really is just about relationships and yeah, and we can get started. So my background has always been working in the philanthropic side of things. I ended up at McGill Athletics for quite some time, and that's really when I started to realize the power of sport and hone my skills in wanting to work in sport philanthropy. My time at McGill allowed me to test a lot of theories. As I said to Jordan, people kind of looked at it like all the jocks and everyone up on the mountain, and no one really cared about what we did up in athletics, which was awesome for me because I got to ask for forgiveness and not for permission and test it out. And I was really surprised at how angry people were in sport, which I've now, working with a bunch of federations, have seen that sort of play out everywhere, where a lot of athletes tend to leave the sport with negative feelings, particularly the higher the level they go, the angrier they are. And there's typically that 10-year window where, you know, they potentially come back, but it takes a bit of time for them to cool off. And so it was the same thing at the university level, as you can imagine, and found it really interesting to see how, as you were all speaking to earlier, no matter where you go, people will just talk about their sport and they'll welcome you in and they're a part of a family. And so knowing that there was that love for the sport and their teammates and their experience, it was how do we figure out to get sort of past all the other gray area and get people back into the sport, and finding ways that they wanted to be engaged and finding ways that they wanted to still be able to be in touch with their teammates and sort of just, you know, a bit of a throwback to their playing days or keeping them involved as they went. So what was really important was looking at, you know, looking at the current situation and really listening to everyone. And I'll use, when I was talking with Jordan, I actually used the McGill men's rugby team as an example, because when I got in there, there was really nothing happening. And I know from where I grew up out in St. Anne de Bellevue in Montreal, we have a ton of rugby players and the community is so strong. So I couldn't figure out why at McGill people were really still so disengaged, and I knew pockets of things were happening, but their actual relationship with the current team was not there. And so I called a bunch of the guys into the office, because at the time they were really just sort of living off of this $10,000 endowment that they'd get every year, and let them know that, sorry guys, that money is running out next year. So, you know, you've been sort of lucky to have this. And so when that was happening and their feet were to the fire, it was, how do we create a plan to get these people back into our community, both in ways to support non-financially, which is really important in sport, but then also to look at how, you know, eventually that alumni engagement would lead into some financial support for the program. And so we started small again, you know, with especially a team like that at McGill is a level 2 team, so really not a lot of support. And so how can we just do little tweaks? And it just started with, let's figure out even who our alumni are. We don't even know where they are. We don't even have their contact information. So how do we go back? You know, we kind of took the plan of like, let's go back team captains every 5 years and sort of create a Facebook group or a LinkedIn group and find out, you know, where are the people and how do we slowly bring them back in? And long story short, we did end up, you know, taking a lot of time to do that. It was, you know, not overnight. I would say we started working on that in probably about 2014-ish. And now they're one of the teams that actually has the deepest alumni program. They raised one of the highest amounts of money for the program. It's incredible what they've done. At the time when I was there, we had the Covo Cup, which is one of the oldest tournaments in North America, McGill, Harvard. And that had been essentially just completely disbanded. They've brought that back. They do it every year again. The alumni now go down to Harvard for it. So it's really incredible what they've been able to do. And that was just a couple of really motivated athletes a part-time coach, but then the volunteers that we were able to engage. And so Jordan had reached out to me because he came across an article of mine that I wrote a couple of years ago for CIRC, and what the focus was on was how can our sport federation sort of tap into that world of alumni, because I eventually left McGill. I loved what I was doing, but I wanted to be able to work with more sport organizations and apply a similar strategy. And when I was my eyes were open to the world of our sport federations and realizing that they were in the same, predicament that we were in at McGill Athletics, where we have all these people who are so passionate about sports. They can raise money. They do all this amazing work in the community. They have all of these people who love the sport, but they still struggle because so much of it is volunteer based. A lot of people don't even know that you can donate to sport federations, and people oftentimes have those negative feelings. And how do you account for everyone that's in your community? And how do you also just start small and not try to take on too much and feel overwhelmed? And so I loved going out and working with our federations. Canoe Kayak Canada was actually the first one who approached me, who didn't just say, hey, I want you to come in and raise, $1 million in a year, which is almost next to impossible. But they really said, we want to focus on a slow build with our alumni, and where do we start from that? And so I'll take you through just a couple quick examples, and then definitely want to let you ask some questions. But at the same time, I was working with Rowing Canada and I was working with Canoe Kayak Canada, and Rowing Canada very quickly decided their alumni were national team athletes. Like, that's it. You had to wear the leaf and then you're an alumni for us. Whereas the route that we took with Canoe Kayak Canada was, I had a little bit more flexibility with them. And I said, we need to listen to people first. So let's actually survey our community, which that in itself was sort of a big undertaking, try to figure out where everyone is. Survey our membership, but also outside of our membership, where are people who maybe got lost along the way, and let's try and find as many people as we can, survey them, and let people self-identify. So we actually just asked people, what is sort of the highest level you went in paddling? And then we just asked, are you an alum? And so people self-identified, and when we let people self-identify, everybody said they were an alum. And so it was really incredible to see, because it was somebody who maybe just paddled growing up, was part of their local canoe club, and they considered themselves an alumni. And looking at that, when you're trying to build something like that, why would you want to restrict yourself? And I understand some sports do want to be restrictive, and that's how they want to go. But I would definitely say, the wider you can cast your net, then definitely the more beneficial that is to your community, because at the end of the day, you want everyone to feel included. What we did with Canoe Kayak Canada was we looked at a way to sort of add an extra element. So if you did represent us nationally, we have a little bit of a special logo that when athletes retire, we give them an alumni hat, and they have this little extra sort of nod that we recognize they're Olympians or on the national team. But when we talk about any of our alumni initiatives, it's essentially the entire community. The way we defined it was, if you held a paddle and you were part of a club, then you are an alum of ours. And so it became really important to look at, okay, so now step one is we kind of figured out, we want to do an alumni program, but we needed to define what that program was going to be. And again, not trying to take on too much, but just saying, we want to just be able to look at nationally, how can we support our clubs, and start to even just put in one alumni event a year. That was it. And to say, okay, if we have an annual summit, let's just have a little alumni cocktail, and then we'll start there, and we'll start to grow it that way. And then the second aspect was then, as I mentioned, defining the alumni. So looking at people to self-identify and actually figure out who these people are and start to build a bit of a database. And then we just went hard with the engagement. So, kind of had our launch. We're really excited. How do we collect information on these people? Made a very simple Google Doc form on the CKC website. Anytime we spoke to people, anytime people came to events, we just asked them to sign up. And so that way we were able to start to capture really great information. We were able to find out, what are some service anniversaries, people who've been volunteers for 50 years, people who, I was telling Jordan, you can never be perfect. And one of the first events that we tried to do was we looked at doing alumni reunions. So we started celebrate. The first one we ever did was Olympic reunions. And we did Mexico, Seoul, and Beijing. And trying to find the Olympic team for Mexico, even Seoul, actually even Beijing, no one had accurate records. So between the COC, CKC, the International Federation, we didn't have accurate records. So we did our best. Of course, we put out the invitation to everyone, and I got a really angry email from the boat driver from the Mexico Olympics telling me that he was part of the team, and how dare I forget to invite him to this and not recognize him as an alumni. And I said, you know, I apologize. We didn't have your contact information, but great news, you found us. And so even to that extent, like his name was nowhere on an Olympic team, but he truly believed that he was an Olympian and part of that group. And so great. So he ended up coming to the event, and now he's been fully engaged, and he brought his kids, and he's been donating a bit to the program. And so it's been a lot of lessons learned, because as you go through this, it's a lot of trial and error. But ultimately, I think a lot of it comes down to just trying to start and looking at it specifically at a club level, not trying to take on too much, but just saying, okay, how do we even just start to build a list? I know from what Jordan's told me that being able to keep a database is, you guys have done a pretty good job to that end. But then also, is there another way to clean up that list and maybe engage some alumni, some people within the community who could potentially help you get their contact information, whether it starts some kind of a Facebook group, LinkedIn, whatever that may be, and then just try to build upon that. I think sometimes people, especially in sport, I found they might get their back up thinking that you are coming just looking for money or always looking for a handout. And I think what's really great in sport, and what we were able to do really successfully at McGill especially, and we're seeing that now at the federations, is being able to talk about the fact that, you know, we have so many athletes who retire, and they sometimes come up against some mental health concerns, just given how difficult it is to transition out of that sport. So a huge component was, let's actually recognize retirements. And that was something so small, because at our national championships, all we did was just add on a little thing to say, these are our athletes that are retiring, and now congratulations, you're retiring into becoming an alum of ours. And this is sort of the next step of your relationship with us. We're able to have alumni offer up internships for some of our athletes, do a lot of networking. So that was a huge thing that came out. Like the things are always the same. The demands is they want better communication, they want the opportunity to network, and they just want to know what's going on, and they want to go to events. Like that's it. It really comes down to those three things. So when we're able to sort of build those buffers for them and create a bit of a program around those three pillars, then they're happy. Like even something as simple as, hey, the Olympics are happening, let's all meet up at this pub, obviously pre-COVID, but let's all meet up at this pub to watch a game together. Or, you know, when it was during the Summer Olympics, we would create just casual events, and we had people in different provinces that would meet up and just try to host something super casual. So it's little things like that that do actually go a long way, just keeping in mind that it's not necessarily we're asking you to come be involved and we want you to volunteer X amount of hours. It's just like, hey, do you have internships that you could offer some of our athletes? Or, hey, do you think you could mentor one of our athletes? Hey, do you think you could just host a pub night for a group of people in your area, just to start to bring people back, and we can call it an alumni event and try to regroup that community and slowly build upon that. So I find it incredibly, incredibly important. I think as I've seen it grow, it's really nice to see a lot of the federations and clubs sort of take that on. I've noticed now, even within Canoe Kayak Canada, the local clubs are taking ownership of that, and they're really proud of that. Something that's just become synonymous now is when there's national championships, there's a huge alumni component to it. We're getting alumni back racing. So we've brought in different alumni games, which is something we were doing at the university as well. And just something simple and fun like that, it goes a long way with the community. So I didn't want to rush through everything, but I'm sure if you have questions, happy to answer them. And yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you, Samantha. And I think, yeah, some of the ideas and everything, like I know she's speaking a lot from an NSO level, but I think it's so transferable down to a community rugby level as well. Like with the clubs being on this call, essentially, you're the ones who are the most connected to your local rugby communities. And I find that maybe it's maybe a lot simpler or easier for you to get that engagement, to host some key events, whether or not they're an alumni flag game annually or special game nights where alumni are invited and included in sort of that kind of programming. But there's a wealth of ideas and opportunity out there. And two, as I had mentioned to Samantha during our conversation, the sport of rugby is in a unique situation where we've had a national registration system since 2006. So some provinces and clubs have done a better job keeping records. We've bounced from a few different registration systems, but at the end of the day, we started collecting data on our members back in 2006. So I know within Saskatchewan here, we've actually built out some alumni lists of each of our senior clubs, starting from 2007, and they've been just checked. They've been updated up until 2014. So there's a future summer student project I've got in the works to update the rest of those lists. But something like that is a really good opportunity to use, a tool to use to be able to reach out to your past players and your past volunteers within your system. I know a lot of times clubs are very focused on a season basis, right? Getting the season started, your preseason, your planning, your games. Then after that, you kind of lose touch of the people and sometimes losing those relationships. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity that, you know, having the tools around you to be supportive of trying to engage and build an alumni program like that. So
I think what's important to, I was just going to say, I find, and I have worked mostly with the NSOs. The thing is it's the clubs that make or break it. So as at the NSO level, what I was trying to do is I try to put the structure in place so that as an NSO, that is typically an NSO's responsibility is to support obviously their community. So what we're trying to do is put the structure in place, but at the end of the day, without the clubs being able to feel supported or without the clubs being able to build their own build their own structure, then it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. And so even something as simple as helping the clubs to understand, hey, you know, one of them, I remember they reached out and they gave us a week's notice. They're saying, oh, by the way, we're celebrating our 60th anniversary of our canoe club. I thought, that's incredible. Like we could have gone back and helped you with the archives. There's so much that we could have done there. And what are the service anniversaries? Like as a club, you could be recognizing your volunteers who have been there for X amount of years, your own anniversaries, your own, you know, athletes that have gone on to go and do things. And so being able to just start at that level is where it's crucial, as opposed to, again, like the idea of trying to take it on so much that I would do it at a national level to say, here's the entire structure and try to move it forward. I'd say there's probably a much higher likelihood of success to be able to implement it at the club level. And then I think that's what ends up pushing it upwards to help the PSOs and the NSOs at a greater level too. I saw, well, yeah, you answered the database question. One of them, and the one I actually like using, there's one of them is called Bloomerang, like boomerang, but BLOOMERANG. It's around $500 to $600 a year. It depends on how many records you have. I know that's not affordable for some clubs. You know, you could always go the route of an Excel sheet, which is, even at the McGill level, everybody loves their Excel sheets. And we had coaches and teams who had multiple Excel files. But I think, you know, even like I was saying, if you even have one space where you have just a Google form on your website or anywhere that you could share with people and they're filling that in, and you have one person who's, of course, you have to be with privacy and everything, extremely careful with how that's shared. But that ended up being the easiest way because nobody wants to answer a bunch of questions, but we're able to keep a few key high-level questions and slowly build our database that way. So even at that level, until we were able to prove that it was worth investing in a database, we were just collecting information through the Google form and keeping it in an Excel document.
Samantha, if I could just cut in, I guess one of the things that I would say that some clubs here do quite a good job of is maintaining that alumni network. Obviously, the uncomfortable part of these of the relationship is ultimately the ask. Is there any tips you have around, whether it be asking for volunteer hours or for asking for money? Like, is there any sort of tips you have around handling that part, the uncomfortable conversation? Please.
I agree. Actually, peer-to-peer ends up being the easiest way. So what was great when we first started working on this, actually everywhere, is I've always said, and I work in this space, I never want to ask somebody for money. And I never have. My whole raison d'etre is to actually create the opportunities and let people ask how they can help. And if you do that, that typically happens. I've never asked for money in my life because it makes me feel extremely uncomfortable. So I hear that. What was great was when we were talking about building the alumni program, everywhere that I've done so, we speak about it in a way where this is what we're trying to do, and we're trying to help grow the community and build the sport. And that's whether it's financial support, whether it's, personal time, whether it's your network, whether it's internship opportunities or jobs or whatever it may be. What we did was we put together an alumni council. And so we just asked people, we're building this alumni council. We want just, a couple representatives from different disciplines and different regions and things like that. Obviously, if it's just at the club level, you can keep it a lot smaller. And then we asked people to join, and we had too many people volunteer. So we ended up having to cut back, which was great because we sort of staggered it and said, we're going to do 2-year terms, and we'll bring different people on in different capacities, but we wanted to make sure we hit a couple of specific markers in terms of representation. And then, so that was a great problem to have. And then they themselves started talking about how are we going to raise money? That was the first thing. And so we actually encouraged them to say, think back to when you were an athlete, what were some projects that you would have been helpful? Like what is like our first kickoff alumni initiative that we could do where we would raise money? And what was really cool was they all came to the agreement that, and this is very specific to the sport, but to travel to national championships with your boats is extremely expensive. And so they came up with the idea to have a crowdfunding campaign for boat transportation. And so we had this one alumni who actually is a finance guy, and he came up with this whole calculation based on the distance that your club was from national championships and how many athletes you had, and created a formula. And then we took all the money that we raised, and based on that formula, you got a grant to your club. So the reason it was successful was because the alumni came up with it. It hit home because it came from something that they had experienced. So pretty much everyone bought into that crowdfunding campaign. And then we were extremely transparent with how the money was distributed. And then they asked themselves. So the alumni decided, we wanted to kick in their own amount of money, and then they asked their teammates. So it was a lot easier than someone having to ask someone they didn't know. It was basically just sort of a challenge, like, hey, I'm throwing in $100. Would you throw in $100? And it really became easy. So the peer-to-peer aspect is super important. I think as you get more sophisticated in building out these committees, with Rowing Canada, for example, when we built out a very specific one to raise money for a national training center, it was literally on the job description that you had to give money and you had to ask for money. So it was right there. And we just put it right. So like when you accepted, you knew what you were getting into. And that was really, really important, because for the most part, people who are also giving at that level are very used to it. So putting it out there in the job description was just kind of saying, like, front and center. This is what we're here to do. We have a pretty massive goal of funds to raise, and if you're in or out, then you know what you're in for.
No, thanks very much. That's really insightful.
Yeah, but I think it doesn't seem as daunting as it is. I think putting it out there to say, like, first, like, who actually just wants to join us? Because I think you'd probably be surprised with how many people would want to get involved. Then it just becomes a bit of making sure you don't get completely overrun with the volunteer management aspect of it, because that can also become time consuming. So keep it as small and simple as possible. Just reading the. Great. I can share the article. I don't know, Jordan, did you send that along?
I haven't yet. Yes, I'll share it in the chat here, and then we plan to PDF it and put it out as part of the information of these sessions too. So
great.
Awesome. There's no other questions. We'll let Pete wrap us up tonight.
Ooh, I don't want to follow any of those presenters. That was an unreal lineup today. Oh, holy smokes. No, but yeah, it was really good that we could have everybody join us. You know, Stephen, Zach, Ryan, Samantha. It was amazing to hear all your thoughts and your experiences. And as always, we thank you so much for helping us enhance our sport. So now I think we're going to do our typical hang around now. So if you want to unmute yourself and just have a chat, hang out, we'll turn the recording off and we can let loose like rugby people like to do. But again, thanks everybody for joining us. We'll be back next week, which will be at even a different, or the 23rd. So can't wait to see who we got then.
March 2nd, I think.
Oh, March 2nd, we get a week off. Okay, great.
And just to segue on to Samantha's outro is that will be the main topic of our next seminar is volunteer management with Volunteer Manitoba. So great work.
Good luck with that one.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
What time was it in Australia for Zach?
It's a nice 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's actually
okay, not too bad. Okay.
Yeah, no, the evenings work great. It's trying to get guests from the UK that is very, very difficult at this time of night. So
yeah, we
have to do morning webinars if we want English guests.
Yeah.
And I'll get Zach Elliott's. I've just put Zach's contact details in the chat as well. If anyone wants to get in touch with him, he's happy to oblige.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Yeah.
Hi guys, thanks very much for involving me. I just put in the chat box if I've sent through the PDF to Brianne, and please don't hesitate to contact me. And one of the beauties in my role is, you know, if I don't directly know what you're needing, then I usually know someone that does know how to answer your queries. So please don't hesitate. Okay, take care. Bye.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been putting these on. I'm really trying to encourage more people from our organization to come, because very simple points I can take back, like, hey, why is nobody responding to my fundraising request? Because, you know, there are old boys. They want to hear from the old boy who was president when they were around, not me.
Yeah,
Got
yeah.
it. Like,
yeah.
Very practical things I can sort of take from that.
Yeah, and if you got any other things you want, just let us know. We're definitely happy to sort of add different things on, because I mean, whether it's a club level or like a Rugby Alberta or Rugby Saskatchewan, Manitoba level, like we're all same issue, just on a different scale.
We had a big club ideation session on the weekend, but I was like, everybody's got other ideas, but I'm like, there's sports research out there. Like, there's people who do this for a full-time job. Let's just go see what they say. Like, I know we have all our ideas, and my club here did this, and my club did that. But it's like trying to rein some of that into like what's actually going to work. Or
it's just like coaching. People don't have any qualms stealing what another coach does. So why do we have qualms, you know, stealing what other other organizations, sports or clubs are doing as far as the other stuff, right? Like
our board meetings are going to be very packed with information from this. They should have been there. But no, this is very useful information, so thank you.
And the recordings will be out there somewhere, right? I think we're just maybe editing it into a uploadable file size.